Estimados estudiantes, profesores, emprendedores, colaboradores, distribuidores e invitados especiales de McGraw Hill, muchas gracias por acompañarnos a este gran evento. En McGraw Hill estamos muy emocionados por contar con la presencia de Barry O Reilly, autor del libro Desaprender. A continuación, les voy a compartir una breve semblanza de nuestro autor. Barry O Reilly es fundador y CEO del campus para ejecutivos denominado Exec Camp, organización que brinda una experiencia emprendedora para la alta dirección de negocios, así como la consultora de administración Anteni, cofundador de Nobody Studios, con un grupo de inversionistas con la misión de crear 100 empresas atractivas en los próximos años. Trabaja con líderes empresariales y equipos que buscan inventar el futuro, no temerlo. Es, además, consultor de negocios, emprendedor, solicitado conferencista, pionero en la intersección del modelo empresarial de innovación, desarrollo de productos, diseño organizacional y la cultura de la transformación. Trabaja con líderes innovadores en todo el mundo, desde startups disruptivas hasta empresas enlistadas en la revista Fortune. Es colaborador frecuente de los diarios The Economist, Strategy Plus Business y el MIT Sloan Management Review, así como coautor del bestseller internacional Lean Enterprise, cómo organizaciones de alto desempeño innovan en escala, incluido en las series de Eric Rice, como una lectura obligada de la Harvard Business Review para los CEOs y líderes de empresas. También es asesor ejecutivo y académico en la Universidad Singularity, con sede en la ciudad de San Francisco. Su misión es ayudar a las empresas con propósito, dirigidas por la tecnología, a innovar a escala. Antes de iniciar el evento, les quiero mencionar que contamos con servicio de traducción simultánea al español con el botón que se encuentra en el panel inferior de la pantalla que dice Interpretation. Barry, before to start, I only would like to say that it's a great honor to be with you and to have the opportunity to listen to your experience, study cases, and suggestions to unlearn and learn again. So please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here and share some of these stories with everybody. So when you're writing a book, you're always looking for inspiration wherever you can find it, maybe from people all over the world. And maybe my inspiration when I was looking out for ways about what I was seeing in the industry, with the pace of change, technology innovation, customer demand shifting, I was always interested to find out what were the sort of key skills and capabilities that were going to help us be successful in the future and not get stuck in the past. But as part of that journey, as looking into the future, I actually started going into the past and going back over 2,000 years ago to the seed of a civilization, a startup, if you will, that sprung into being in Central Europe. And that startup would go on to sort of scale and sustain itself as one of the great cultures that we've known. Now, at the peak of its powers, the Roman Empire accounted for roughly about 20% of the world's population and covered more than 2 million square miles. And for almost 500 years, it remained the world's leading cultural and economic powerhouse. Now, there's lots of sort of ideas about what allowed this culture in particular to sort of scale and sustain itself for so long. Do you want to take a guess? Maybe in the comments you could sort of share, what do you think was the unique innovation that the Romans had that allowed them to sort of scale and sustain themselves for so long? It's always fun to sort of see what people guess in the chat. Yeah, roads comes up a lot. Yeah, great, roads. Often, sometimes people say their army. Yeah, roads again, good, all right, like it. Yeah, the discipline, yeah, very good. the way they organize themselves, I think often comes up, their governments. And the answer is all of these aspects contributed, but there was one very unique aspect to Roman culture that allowed them to be so successful. You see, whenever they fought or engaged with other peoples, whenever they found practices were better than their own, they let go of their existing practices and incorporated the new practices of operation into the way that they worked. So in essence, they had this ability to adapt to changing circumstances by unlearning what had brought them success in the past and relearning new skills to help them adapt to the current future. And this was really inspiring for me when I was starting to think about, well, what was the future look like about great organizations and great cultures. So when I started to dive into more about this idea of unlearning, another one of the references I came across was Bo Hemberg. And he talked about this idea that as knowledge grows, simultaneously, it becomes obsolete as our reality changes. So really understanding involves both learning new knowledge and discarding obsolete or misleading knowledge. And this was another sort of really interesting aha moment for me, is as the world changes, so does our understanding of the world. And therefore, if we're not constantly adapting to those changing circumstances, taking new information in and letting go of outdated information, and this is sort of one of the challenges we can get stuck in. You know, and the same is true of many of the most leading organizations of the world. Even 20 years ago, a lot of the companies were all about being number one in their market, grow as big as you can, scale through people. And even sort of less than 10 years ago, it was still very much the same until everything changed. And while some of these companies that are now the largest in the world, even $2 or $3 trillion valuations, the price of oil has gone to zero. And what's been unique about these technology companies is that they've scaled through technology, not through people. They've built systems that allow them rapidly learn at huge volumes how people interact with their services and adapt to the changing circumstance. And the trap is, though, that leaders get stuck. They have a very linear mindset about what thinks they will make them successful. They believe the things that brought them success in the past will bring them success in the future. But innovation actually happens on a much more exponential curve. Things that look initially deceptive or not of high value suddenly have these exponential returns. You could think of cloud computing like this, or even the internet. Initially a very slow adoption, but then a huge adoption. And the problem is that most people get stuck on the linear mindset of what they believe. So the way I try to think about it is that disruption actually doesn't happen to organizations. The truth is it happens to people. We get stuck to our existing or legacy mindsets and behaviors. So just like a product has features, and you've got to constantly innovate the features of a product for it to stay relevant in its market, humans have behavior. So if you're not constantly innovating your behavior to match the market, there's a risk that you will ultimately be disrupted. So when I think about the greatest leaders that I've worked with, they've cultivated this capability within themselves to innovate. They seek out situations that enable them to grow. They're uncomfortable, uncertain, but it puts them outside their initial comfort zone so they grow new skills and develop. And these are the principles at the heart of the cycle of unlearning. So often when I ask people or say to people they need to unlearn, a lot of people get quite upset. They initially say or believe that I think everything that they know is wrong and nothing could be further from the case. Now, the way that I describe unlearning is it's a process of letting go, reframing and moving away from once useful mindsets and acquired behaviors that were effective in the past, but now limit our success. So it's not forgetting, removing, or discarding your knowledge or experience. It's the conscious act of letting go of outdated information and actively engaging in taking in new information to inform your decision-making and action. You know, what I find from working with these amazing leaders that I'm going to share some case studies of shortly was they're some of the most talented people in the world. But where they kept getting stuck, or what I would say was the significant inhibitor in helping people get better, was not their ability to learn new things, but their inability to unlearn the mindsets, behaviors, and actions that were effective in the past, but now limit their success. And this is what really struck me as about why we needed to unlearn. So maybe at this stage, you're sort of sitting there going, okay, Barry, I think I get a sense of what unlearning is about. How do I know what I need to unlearn? And there's a series of questions that I ask people when I'm working with them to help them sort of understand or diagnose areas that they may need to unlearn. And so I want you to think about these 4 questions, and maybe if you have a piece of paper, you might write down your answer or see what ideas pop up in your head. So can you think of a situation where you're not achieving the outcomes you desire? Maybe you're not living up to the expectations that you have for yourself. Is there situations that you're struggling to resolve, or a challenge that you're avoiding altogether? Or maybe you can try everything that you can think of and you're still not getting the breakthroughs that you're looking for. Have a think about these questions. Not living up to the outcomes you desire, not getting the expectations you have for yourself, situations you're struggling to resolve or avoiding, or maybe you've tried everything you can think of and you're still not getting the desired results. See what ideas start to pop into your mind. If you want, you could even share a few of them in the channel. What I find is when I ask people these questions, it's not really a matter of them coming up with 1 or 2 things. They're actually come up with 5 or 6. And these are all obstacles that you feel are in your way, challenges you have that you can't get past. And there are signals that your existing behavior is not working. And therefore, you're probably going to need to unlearn and relearn new behaviors to get that breakthrough. And what I found from coaching this to people is once I was able to help them diagnose areas where they might need to unlearn, really it was then just about framing the obstacle they're facing as the outcome that they were aiming for, transitioning from the problem to actually the success that they hope to achieve. And then once they could describe the success that they were aiming for, it was really about relearning, helping them think big about what they wanted to do differently, but then start small and take small, uncomfortable steps to sort of learn new behaviors. And by trying these new behaviors, they ultimately led to breakthroughs, new information that helped them either something worked or didn't, but allowed them to adapt. And really, unlearning was not just sort of a one and done. It was a virtuous system. The more people practiced it, the better they got, and they could put more and more problems into that. Now, often when I'm asked about, well, where should I start when I start to unlearn? I do talk about thinking big, but always starting small. And the best place to start is actually with yourself. Think about areas that you need to sort of get better with. Some of the behaviors you might want to change. Often people tell me, well, we need to change the company culture. But what I often say is, well, what role modeling could you do to exhibit new culture in your organization that you'd like to see? Some people like to practice at home and some people prefer to practice at work, but it's important that you start with yourself. And then the next thing you want to think about is as you're role modeling these new behaviors, it actually inspires the people around you, your team. And then you can start to think of as a team, what are some of the behaviors we may need to unlearn, right up to the organizational level where you're inspiring huge organizational change. Again, because it's a collective individual change. One of my favorite examples of this is the CIO at Volkswagen Financial Services. His name's Christian Metzer. You know, and a lot of people would say to Christian, well, it's very easy. You're a CIO. You just sort of sit in meetings all day. You don't really have to do anything. You don't understand what it's like to try and change. So Christian did something very interesting. He uses a method called culture hacks, where he does these very small changes in behavior that have very high visibility about what he's doing. And so he offered the opportunity for anyone to apply for his job for the day, where they could be the CIO of Volkswagen for the day. And a number of people in the company applied for it, and an engineer that had been with the company for 2 years won the right to do the job. And so for the entire day, Christian followed this engineer around the company to see how the team would perform when somebody else was playing the role of the CIO. But it was interesting for him to observe the behaviors about how people made decisions where they got stuck. And actually halfway through the day, they had an outage from one of their biggest systems. And Christian still persisted with the 2-year engineer to play the role of CIO as to see how the team would solve the problems. So these are some great examples of different ways about how companies can actually role model some of these ways to unlearn and show how they can be done. You know, and we're doing this at the moment. I've just started a venture studio named Nobody Studios, where we're trying to launch 100 companies over the next 5 years. You know, and even the way that we start to build and change companies is radically different about how it's been done before. When you think about trying to create 100 companies in 5 years, it's 20 companies a year. You know, you have to start realizing that a lot of the behaviors that have made us successful in the past to create one company are not going to work when we're trying to create 100 at this volume. You're forced to recalculate. So already we're starting to innovate the way we build companies by involving the crowd, from our ideation process to validation and turning up the noise on companies when we launch. We're going to be the first venture studio to offer crowdfunding to anyone in the world. So that means anyone with a couple of $100 will be able to invest in a venture studio and not only own a piece of the studio, but see upside from every single company that the studio creates forever. We're fundamentally unlearning the way venture capital and investing can be done. So when you're thinking about the characteristics that you need to cultivate when you're trying to unlearn, there's a few. The first one is curiosity. And this is the ability to sort of take in new information that is at odds with what you currently believe. You know, another one of my favorite examples is Joe Norenia, who's the COO of HSBC Global Markets. You know, what Joe used to do is when the graduates would come into the company each year, he would sit down with them and give them problems to work on that he was working on. So they could see different ways, or he could learn different ways to solve problems, new technologies, tools. And you can imagine a company like HSBC, when one of the most senior people sits down with the most junior person to sort of explain to them how to do their job, right? It creates a great cultural artifact in the company. The next one is ownership. So if you're not getting the results that you desire, or things aren't working out, what do you do? If you can't lose that 5 kilos because is it the chocolate bar's fault or is it your own? The truth is, unlearners are great at owning the results and then thinking about what they can do differently to get a better outcome. And then it's about commitment, doing things that you're not good at, that you might struggle with, but committing to give them a try and find a way through. And that requires us being comfortable with being uncomfortable, trying things that are outside our known sphere, our comfort space, but trying to learn our way through it. And this is why this ability to create safety to succeed is so important. Starting small is a really powerful way to do this. We think big, but start small, because small creates psychological safety. You can make small errors with your team and recover from them. Small steps through safe to fail experiments allow us to learn what works in a controlled manner. And then small is also small economic risks. You're making small investments to find out what works and what doesn't. So this is the power and the principles behind the cycle of unlearning. So what I'm going to do for the second part of this talk really is just to share a couple of examples of companies I've been working with over the last few years. Give you a sense of some of the transformations that these folks have to go through as they unlearned, and then hopefully give you a bit of inspiration for how you might work differently going forward. So the first one is about leadership mindset. And I love this idea from just helping leaders understand how can they challenge their mindset to be successful. You know, $365 billion is spent every year on executive development, but only 1 in 4 people say that the training was critical to any business outcomes. Now, if I was sort of running this type of program and I only had a 25% success rate, I'd probably be thinking that the way we're teaching people how to learn needs to be unlearned. And this was one of the sort of aha moments I had even about how I was doing and creating companies or teaching myself, is that actually the way you shift people's mindset is not letting them sort of sit in meetings and talking to them all day about how they need to learn. They need to practice new behavior. You see, the way to change the way you think is not to just sit in a room and be told something different. It's to start acting differently. You see, by acting differently, we start to get a new perspective. We see new, different information that sort of affects the way that we see the world. And then that new information changes our mindset and encourages us to keep taking new behavior. So really to unlearn your sort of mindset actually means you need to start not thinking differently, but acting differently. And by acting differently, you experience the world in a different way. That gives you new information, and that starts to shift your mindset, and which again, in turn, encourages you to shift your behavior. You know, one of the companies I work with is International Airlines Group. They're the holding company for Aer Lingus, British Airways, Iberian, and a bunch of other airlines. They're the 6th largest airline in the world. You know, and one of the challenges that they were facing is that they were trying to innovate or come up with new products or new ways of doing things. So we had a program where we were trying to launch 6 new products over 8 weeks. And we took out 6 of the senior most executives from the entire company for 8 weeks with the goal to launch new businesses to disrupt the airline industry. Now, very early in the piece, we had one of the CTOs of one of the airlines who had this perfect idea to change the way that airline bookings were done. And they were positive based on all their experience from the time that they'd spent in the airline industry about how the solution needed to work. So what we managed to do is get them to say, well, could you create a prototype of the idea that you're thinking and testing it with customers? And they were delighted to. So we sat down and got the CTO to sit down and start to interview with the customers. So how do you think it first went when they showed their prototype to customers? What do you think the reaction was? Well, it was quite funny. They showed their prototype to customers, and the initial reaction was, oh, well, it sucks. It doesn't work. Customers had no idea what they were thinking. So what do you think the executive's reaction was? Well, they were like, silly customer. This is the wrong customer for my idea. We just need to get the right customer. So we did this again and again and again and again. But we kept getting the same results where the customers would say, didn't get it. So eventually I sat down with the CTO and said to them, what do you think is happening here? And this is when they had their breakthrough moment. They realized that they were pushing their ideas onto customers, not pulling information from them. And really, the problem was not the customer, it was their idea. And when they had that sort of moment or that inflection point where they realized the trick is actually to listen and then build what you hear rather than tell people what they want and push it on them, they went on to be one of the best of experimenters that I ever worked with. You know, when they heard the ideas didn't work, they were like, great, how can I make this better? You know, and this program was a phenomenal success. We went on to create amazing analytics platforms, the first identity blockchain management system for the airline industry. It was really a sort of powerful experience where British Airways had this huge breakthrough. But then we also made another mistake. After spending these 8 weeks together with high intensity and all these brilliant ideas, we went back to the company then and tried to push all of these ideas back into the company. And that was another huge unlearning moment for them, because they just went and burnt a whole load of money. You know, the teams already had their own ideas that they were working on. They didn't need the executive team to just generate a whole lot of ideas and drop them on the team who were already working on things. And they already had their own work to do. But again, this was another great unlearning moment because we realized that the company already was doing innovation. What we needed to find was another avenue for where executives could take their ideas and collaborate with interesting companies and create new ones. And this encouraged us to start what's called as Hangar 51, which was the first ever venture arm for any airline, where any company who had ideas could come and work with British Airways on a 10-week accelerator program. And British Airways would get a small stake in the company, and then that company would have access to all of British Airways information and data. And a huge amount of innovation has sort of sprung out of that. One of the examples here is this company called hacia, which is a company where they actually monitor the way airlines can be, or fast aircraft can be turned around. And this is all done from a very simple video monitoring system and a bunch of analytics that starts to check, well, what time does the plane actually arrive? What time does the baggage arrive? Is any of the parts missing? And over time, you can start to understand all this data about, is the plane turning around as quickly as possible? You see, you only make money in the airline industry when the plane is in the air. So all the time it's on the ground, you want to turn it around as quickly as possible. And from just building this very simple system that would monitor the aircraft and see that all the component parts are arriving as planned, they could fire off notifications about when there were problems. If something was missing, they could find out quickly. But they also started to gather all this data about what created an efficient turnaround time and actually drove the innovations. Yeah, so Stephen Scott, who's the Chief Digital Officer for IAG, would say, one of the most interesting aspects of all this is most of the time when you're trying to do what you're trying to do, 97% of people will tell you that you should just go back to the way things are done. And that's actually the moment where you need to double down and really sort of push yourself to sort of try and find the breakthroughs, because actually that's the moment where it begins. Pushing people to find these sort of new ways of working. Everyone will tell you it's never going to work, but it takes a different persistence to keep pushing through to find the breakthrough you're looking for. Now, another aspect, the danger that people fall into is knowing it all. And this is where expertise actually becomes a blind spot. And there's many examples of this through history. And one of the companies I work with is probably best described as a well-known phone manufacturer. And this company had been building and delivering phones for over 10 years. And they were positive that they had built the perfect strategy for how they would deliver these phones to the world. So what I actually got them to do is to try and run another small little experiment. I got them to sit down, or took out 5 of the executive team and asked them to try and go and sign up to their own service. And I gave them prepaid credit cards with $1,000 that they could go onto the screen. Yeah, and they could go and try and sign up for their own service. So off they went. I gave them 5 prepaid credit cards to see how they got on. How do you think they went? Well, the fun thing is only one of them managed to actually sign up for their service. Another one nearly did it and 3 others failed miserably. And initially when they came back after attempting this, they were angry and frustrated. They were blaming the credit cards, they were blaming the staff. But actually when they got to sit down, they realized that these failures were like little gifts. They were signals from their systems of work to tell them that they weren't operating as they had planned. And really when they saw these sort of little signals as gifts about ways that they could improve their product or service, it gave them the breakthrough to make an even better system. And this is the power of starting to listen and spend time with your customers. John McGraw is probably one of the more famous CEOs of T-Mobile here in the US. He was appointed in September and actually stepped down from the role earlier this year. And he actually didn't have much of a background in telecommunications, but the way he started the new job was kind of interesting. He didn't hire a whole load of consultants to go and tell them what their problems were. He actually sat down and had a phone line installed in his office where he would listen to customer complaints for 4 hours a day for the first month. And on the back of all listening to all the problems and challenges their customers were facing, he launched this notion of on-carrier. So in March 2013, they introduced a new streamlined plan structure. So any customers, they dropped contracts, subsidized phones, and made all fees the same. So you had a contract fee SIM where you would pay $50 for 500 megabytes per month and 500 minutes. And they absolutely obliterated the competition. Because everyone was struggling with understanding if they traveled, how much their bills would be. There were high variabilities and they didn't want long-term contracts. So he just offered people that product. But they didn't stop there. They kept offering more and more interesting ways to adapt to what their customers wanted. They let people try the iPhone for free, and they put an end to annual contracts. And they started introducing extra subscriptions to your phone, like free music services. They were the first company to do all of the things that you probably look as part of your package in your phone today, because they were listening to their customers in Unlearning. When I went to actually launch the book at the end of 2018, I was invited by Amazon and Verizon to sort of launch the book at AWS reInvent in Las Vegas. You know, and one of the things that sort of really struck me about the whole time there was spending time with the leadership team at Amazon. And what they would say is that 95% of AWS's features come through customer feedback. So they're actually directly building based on customer feedback and the questions that they're asked from their customers about what they want to build. And this was another sort of real aha moment for me about understanding what it takes to create great products by listening to your customers and then responding rather than trying to know it all and tell them what to do. So the last area I wanted to share on is really about understanding behavior and thinking about how you can start to adapt your behavior as you unlearn. Now, if you ever explore the field of behavior design, BJ Fogg is probably the primary thinker in this space. Behavior design is an approach to change human behavior, where you set a target behavior, solve for that behavior, and try and iterate towards it. Now, lots of famous people have actually taken BJ's course in Stanford. You have the founders of Instagram, the head of growth for Uber, even Nir Eyal, who wrote the book Hooked, are all people that have been mentored and trained by BJ. And so I got to go spend time with him in his house in Northern California, where we would talk or teach people how to do behavior design. And the most famous part of his work is the Fogg behavior model. And he talks about when behavior happens, he calls it behavior happens when motivation, ability, and a prompt all put together at the same moment. Yeah, he calls it a BMAP. And he talks about motivation ranging from low to high, and also your ability ranging from low to high, but he writes it as hard to do versus easy to do. So the idea is if you're prompted to perform a behavior, if it's sufficiently easy to do and you're motivated enough, you'll perform the behavior. So if your favorite charity asks you to donate maybe $1, you're probably motivated to support that charity, and it's easy for you to give $1, which will basically, you perform the behavior of donating. Versus where you see a charity that you have no affiliation to, and they want $100 million for you to be part of their donations, you're probably not going to perform. Right, so he talks about this sort of notional action line that when prompted above, if you're sufficiently motivated and have the ability, you'll be successful, versus if you're prompted to do something and you're low motivation and it's hard to do, you're probably not going to perform the behavior. Now, here's another pop quiz. If you were trying to get people to start performing new behaviors, what do you think you focus on first? Do you try and make sure that they are sufficiently motivated? Or do you try and make sure that they make something really, really easy to do? So motivation or ability. Maybe in the chat, people can guess, where do you think you start when you're trying to encourage people to do new behaviors? So motivation's coming up. Ability, more motivation. Great. All right. Well, the answer is you actually start with ability. And the reason you start with ability is it's actually more observable. You see, motivation is very hard to tell. It wavers in individuals at any time. And it's actually really hard to observe, where the ability to do something is observable. So if I asked you to donate cash, I can observe if you have cash or not. So when I say as a charity, we'd love for you to donate, we're asking for $1 in cash. If you said to me, oh, well, I don't carry cash anymore, I'd be like, all right, that's getting people to donate via cash is probably not the ability we want to aim for. Why don't we get people to use tap pay, maybe send Bitcoin or whatever it might be? You can start to iterate and find what will make people donate. Where motivation, it's hard. People will just say, will you donate? They go, yes or no. You can't actually test it. Now, the fun thing about this actually is once you start to understand this model, you can start to see it everywhere. So one of the things I was trying to do a number of years ago is I was trying to shift my own behavior. I was spending too much time on social media, and an area where I felt it was returning very little value to my, accomplishments at the end of the day. So what I decided to do was I wanted to stop the behavior of spending time on social media. So if this model is true, and we talk about behavior happens when motivation, ability, and a prompt all come together at the same moment, what do you think when I sort of starting to not spend time on social media or Facebook in particular, how could I make this more harder to do? What could be some of the things I could try? Well, when you're trying to stop a behavior, the way you actually stop a behavior is you remove the prompt. So first of all, if I turned off all notifications from Facebook on my phone, but I still sort of knew Facebook was on my phone, so I would just sort of squirrel my way down to it when I had a spare moment, had the ability to find it. So then I tried to make it harder to do. So on sort of June 2017, I deleted Facebook from my phone. So even if I wanted to sort of play around with it, I had to like go to a laptop, open up my machine and look at it. Now, because it was really hard to do, I stopped performing the behavior. So over time, I sort of stopped spending as much time on social media. But at the same time, while I was all happy about not having to worry about doing any more social media, all was not good in Mark Zuckerberg's world. He started to say, well, hang on, I want Barry to perform the behavior of logging into my application and giving me his data every day. So what do you think Mark started doing? Well, he started prompting me. So you can see here, I actually deleted Facebook from my phone on June 6th, and he started sending me messages, prompts. Hey, Barry, someone's taking a photo of a cat. Hey, Barry, it's your friend. You should really log in. So, but because it's really hard for me to perform the behavior, this actually starts to become annoying. So I deleted it on the 6th, and you can see even by a week later, I'd received 171 emails trying to get me to log into Facebook to perform the behavior. But because I can't do it and it's made it hard to do, it just becomes annoying. So Mark needs to shift the way he tries to get me to actually log into Facebook. It's not working for me. Right? And these are sort of the ways that you can start to think about transforming your team. It's when you're getting people to try new behaviors, you can start to test to see what works and helps them give an example to do this. You know, a simple way that I try to work with one of the executive teams of one of the world's largest banks here in America is getting them to introduce these tiny new habits after every meeting. So BJ has a sort of method called tiny habits where he said, after a certain event, I will perform this tiny action. So you use the existing routine as a trigger for the new behavior. So one of the things when I sat down with the leadership team is they were constantly saying that their meetings were terrible. They were a waste of time. They were never effective. They never worked really well. So what I said to the CEO is, well, why don't we create a tiny habit? So every time you're conducting a meeting, 5 minutes before the end, why don't you stop and ask all the attendees in the room to share what do they think are some of the outcomes they've achieved from this meeting, and just listen. And the leader would sort of go around the room and listen to the team share about what they think success is. And the power of this is not only did it help him actually understand or learn if people were all aligned, another thing started happening. You see, if a leader starts asking people about how they can make meetings better, all those reports then start replicating that behavior up and down the company. And then next thing you have this sort of wave of effect about how people start to improve how meetings are done and getting aligned on outcomes. We also did a retrospective then with the leadership team, where the CEO sat down and put a post-it note on the wall which said this: agility is hard. And he shared as leading an organization through a transformation that he was surprised how difficult it was. He realized that the company was very focused on just output, just creating documents and clicking off deliverables. But what they really were looking for were outcomes. And by thinking more about outcomes that they were aiming for, it actually helped them to adapt and iterate and move. So these are all some of the little examples that I wanted to share with you today. Because the question is, for you, how can you think big and then start small to unlearn today? And there's a little method that I sort of encourage people to do. I want you to look at that challenges or some of the challenges that you wrote down today about areas where you think you might need to unlearn. And I want you to pick one of those challenges. And then I want you to find somebody that you know, someone you trust, work with, collaborate with, someone at home. And then ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how successful do they think you are at solving that challenge? And maybe they're really kind and they'll give you a 5 out of 10. And I want you to thank them for that. The next thing I want you to do is ask them, how could you get half a point better? What could you do, or new behaviors could you try to get half a point better? And I want you to try and pick one that feels a little bit uncomfortable and give it a go for a week. And then at the end of that week, go back to your friend and say to them, hey, have you noticed I've been trying this new behavior? So on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you think I'm at now? And maybe they'll tell you they're a 6. And if you keep asking them how you can get just half a point better, you'll be amazed with the results. When I wrote this book, it was a real pleasure. I spent time great to see it translated into Spanish, that I can do these events and speak to people all over the world. Somebody sent me this little message after I wrote the book. It was a picture of Serena Williams before the Australian Open reading the book, which is a real inspiration for me. I hope you've had fun listening to this talk today. I'm going to spend time and take as many questions as you can. There's lots of ways to stay connected. I host a podcast where I've had leaders from all over the world on. You can sign up to my newsletters and be connected with all the work that I'm doing all over the world. It's been a real pleasure to share these stories with you. And I'm looking forward to hearing how you get on your journey as you learn to unlearn.
Thank you, Barry. We have some questions. Noé Chavez, he asked, how to convert an enterprise to an agile business through unlearned behavior?
Well, I think this is a bit like the question I shared from Volkswagen Financial Services, right? Trying to transform an entire organization is really difficult. But the best thing that you can do is start by transforming yourself and thinking about what you could do differently to change the way businesses are done, right? And that was one of my favorite things about Christian at Volkswagen, is that he was trying to change the company culture, but he did it by role modeling a change in himself. And by doing that, that's actually what started to inspire his team. So his teams could start to think about, well, as a team, what do we need to unlearn? Right through to an organization talking about what they needed to unlearn. So I always say it's important to think big, start small, start with yourself, start role modeling some of the new behaviors you'd like to see in the company. And that will really start inspiring people to bring changes throughout the whole company.
Perfect. Jorge Moran, he asked, what about business process reengineering?
Yeah, so I think business process reengineering is probably a good example of recognizing that a process that probably was worked at one time needs to change. And often what I find with business process engineering is often technology changes, customer demand changes, or the market changes. So therefore, a process that you had successful maybe 1 year or 5 years or even 6 months ago no longer works, or actually there's a better way to do it. And while that process may be designed perfectly at that time, technology has changed the way that you can synthesize customer feedback. Natural language processing means that we probably don't need to have telephones where you have to sit and wait for option 4 or 5 or 6 to press a button to be sent to the right agent. You can actually jump on phones now and tell people your problem, and natural language processing will send you to the right customer. So you'd re-engineer that process, right? So I think it's just an example about understanding when the world changes, technology changes, customers change, that you re-engineer your processes to meet that. And you just unlearn and relearn exactly the same.
Perfect, Barry. Eric asked, how to break paradigms?
Well, paradigm shifts are not something necessarily you can break, but I think what you can do is try and affect your own viewpoint of them. And this is why I talk about like unlearning leadership mindset. You can't think your way to a new paradigm. You have to act your way there. You have to take some action to understand how that paradigm works. And then it gives you a new perspective, and that's what gives you the breakthrough. So I'll give you a simple example. Say with cryptocurrencies, it's very difficult for people to understand the power of a cryptocurrency by just listening about it. But if you buy a small bit of cryptocurrency and then try and use it, you experience what the power of it is. Simple thing about trying to send money internationally. When I try to talk to a bank about sending money from the US back to Ireland, where I grew up, it takes me about 6 hours worth of phone calls to like set things up and sign off accounts and get things done. And where if I hold a cryptocurrency, I can send it to someone else's wallet in like 7 seconds. That's a paradigm shift. And but the only reason you can understand it is by doing it. So I think that's probably more about, rather than recognizing our paradigm shifts happening, you have to act your way, experience them, and that's what shifts your mindset when you recognize the power of these technologies.
Perfect. We have another question. What is the most complicated case that you have to implement the practices of unlearning, and why?
Well, I think all of them are complicated and they're all unique in their own way, right? I think one of the things that I experience probably more and more is that I'm working with companies and teams that are based all over the world. And what works in one culture might not work in another. And trying to find like actually how you get alignment and harmony about doing things or changing company culture all over the world. And that's why I've sort of found actually this ability to give people the system makes it much more powerful than me trying to tell them what they need to do. When you help people understand areas or problems that they're focused on, and they have a shared language and framework about recognizing a problem and how they need to unlearn, and then coming up with many different options about how they could relearn, that gives you the ability for everyone to be engaged in designing a solution to try and shift the culture. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge and most complicated I've been coming up against, is aligning people from all over the world to work on common problems that they believe they need to unlearn, and then exploring and trying one or two behaviors that they can all relearn together. I would say that's probably the most complicated, and why.
We have another question from Juan Maldonado. He told, unlearning is a continuous learning process. It's when it's useful to improve or change something. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, with the cycle of unlearning, it's not one and done. It's a continuous process of unlearning and relearning and learning and unlearning and relearning. And, the world is just going to change at a faster and faster pace. So we actually have to get more comfortable with our ability to let go of beliefs or assumptions about how the world works quicker and faster and be more adaptable. So I think the people who can actually move in that paradigm will be much more comfortable with the future and the rate of change that we're just going to experience. Some of the companies that are successful today are going to be gone in 5 years. Startups that just move into their new headquarters are going to be disrupted by another startup just as quickly. So I think that's the future that we're going to be living in. And that's why I think this ability to unlearn and relearn has never mattered more.
We have another question from Raul Enriquez. What have you unlearned with the COVID pandemic?
Oh, God. Well, what I've definitely unlearned is I have seen the pandemic more as an accelerant for digital collaboration. So I think we've probably moved 10 or 15 years forward in terms of our ability to collaborate remotely than we had, pardon me. So I think, even if you spoke to someone 18 months ago about starting a company with people that you had never met or been in the same room physically with, from all over the world, and you would build them and start a company with them, people would have said you're crazy. But at Nobody Studios, I have started a venture studio with like 20, 30 people that I have never met in person. But we all share this common belief, and there's people based in Europe, there's people based in North America, South America, Asia, Australia, Africa, But we all believe in this common mission, and because we can collaborate remotely, we've been able to start this studio, and that would have been totally impossible, or just seem unimaginable to people 18 months ago. But now when I say it to people, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So I think that's a great example of unlearning.
Christy Canale, she asked, what difficulty do you think is the greatest obstacle to unlearning in the case of Latinos? Interesting person.
It is. Well, I think it's probably a bit difficult for me to say for Latinos, primarily because I don't get to spend a huge enough time there. So it's probably, I'd be interested what your perspective is. But a lot of the significant obstacles I see for more globally, I guess, the challenges people face, right, is a lot of it comes down to your leadership conditioning. So people only know what good leadership looks like from the people that they've been around them. So if your managers have certain behaviors, that's all you know. So your ability to sort of like see different ways of doing things, I think is really important. That's why curiosity is so important. And our ability to sort of always want to be correct or right can really inhibit us. If we always want to be right, it's very difficult for us to take in new perspectives or try different ways of doing things. So they're the two, I think, that are often some of the biggest blockers. And there's actually a chapter in the book called The Obstacles to Unlearning. It's actually chapter 3. So, you're welcome to sort of look into those and you'll see, what I think all of them are.
We have another question. How was Serena Williams' experience related to Unlearn?
Well, that's what the first chapter of the book is all about. So I sort of don't want to give away too much of the story. But I think one of the most unique things about Serena Williams is that she's nearly 40 years old. Most tennis players retire when they're 27. And she's actually getting better as she's got older. And there's some very unique things that happened to her along the way to help her recognize how to make that transition. So my simple answer to that would be, if you buy the book, you'll find out in the story, the opening story, about what Serena had to unlearn to have these extraordinary results.
Perfect. We have in the webinar, Guillermo Dominguez, who was the editor for the Spanish edition. So he asked, this is very interesting and important question, Barry. In chapter 7 of your book, you mentioned that leadership conditioning is an obstacle to art of unlearning. Could you tell us about the concept that leadership consists of making other people successful?
Yeah, no, and first of all, thank you for editing the book. That's very kind, and I appreciate all the work you did to do that. So, gracias, I would say. This notion of leadership conditioning is so important, right? I always say people don't leave jobs, they leave the leaders. And so there's a responsibility as a leader to really encourage your people to get the best out of them, to listen to their ideas, to help them become the best people that they can be and the best team members that they can be. And I think that's what's so important, right? If you think about the best people you've worked with, the best managers you've had, they're fair, they challenge you, they set goals that are clear that the team need to achieve. They give you tough feedback, but they also encourage you when you're doing things well. And I think that's the kind of leadership conditioning you're looking for. When people are surrounded by managers that are know-it-alls, tell people what to do, don't listen to feedback, that's not the kind of environment most people thrive in. And I think that when you have that type of leadership conditioning is you just copy it and do it again and again. And I think that style of leadership is sort of coming to an end now. And the future, where the more progressive organizations, is about encouraging people to bring their best. The leaders recognizing they don't know all the answers, and building great teams to help them find them.
Perfect, Barry. The time is over. So
Great.
it was a remarkable presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us, Barry. I appreciate your time. And that's it. See you next time.
All right. Thank you very much, Hans, and all the team at McGraw Hill. And it's been a pleasure working with you and doing these events. And thank you, everybody, for your questions. And I look forward to hopefully visiting you all again in Central and South America in post-pandemic and in the future.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.